in Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand, Pabanka Rinpoche talks about these 6 helpful attitudes that we've probably heard before. That we're like a patient. The Holy Dharma is medicine. Our spiritual guide is a skillful doctor. Diligent practice will cure the illness. The Tathagatas are holy beings, and the Dharma should be preserved for a very long time. And so under number 4, that diligent practice will cure the illness, Pabanka Rinpoche advises us not to be lazy and merely studying, but he says we must strive to put our studies into practice. If we don't do this, we become calloused or hardened towards the Dharma. And nothing could be worse, he says. Too much study and too little meditation is caused to become unyielding, intractable towards the Dharma. So we need to take our studies further through frequent reflection and meditation. Otherwise, there will be less impact when we study later on. Eventually, no matter how profound an instruction we study may be, we might find ourselves thinking, oh, I've heard that. Tell me something new. I've already done that one. And our studies will be of no benefit to our mental continuum. So this phrase, I think, or this idea that our minds could be hardened or callous towards the Dharma is a very important one to think about. And especially in a situation like we have here, we're hearing teachings, we're listening to teachings a lot during the week. And so, for instance, recently we had the amazing good fortune to listen to teachings on the last 4 chapters of Aryadeva's 400 stanzas with Geshe Yeshe Tabke. And each day Geshe would lead us so beautifully in the motivation, really urging us to listen and study and reflect and especially to meditate on the teachings, not just to leave them at the intellectual level. And that was all for the larger purpose of doing what we can to relieve the suffering of sentient beings. And it wasn't easy material that we covered, was it? A lot of refutations and of assertions that were relevant at the time of the Buddha. But what a great opportunity to reflect on dependent arising and emptiness. So it was very, very worthwhile. So to follow his advice, it seems that we can either take those verses into a retreat situation and really reflect on them, going through them again and again, trying to apply them to our lives. Or we can also follow his advice by taking 1 or 2 or 3 verses a day and just reflecting on them, trying to incorporate them, trying to use them in our daily life and understanding of the world around us as well as ourselves. So this is what I've been attempting to do. And here are a couple of examples that might be helpful. In chapter 13, someone says, it's impossible to apprehend that phenomena have no inherent existence. Because if they lacked inherent existence, they would be totally non-existent, like the horns of a donkey, and would not be directly perceptible. However, a pot is directly perceptible. Therefore, all functioning things inherently exist. Do you remember that one? So this person that's putting this forward is equating inherent existence with existence. After all, things appear to our senses to inherently exist. And they say that we directly perceive them to inherently exist. That's their position. They assume that if things do not inherently exist, they couldn't exist at all. How could they? That's their question. How could they exist? But all Buddhist schools agree that, at least on this description of inherent existence, that if something inherently existed, when we looked for it among it, the basis of designation or the basis for labeling, we'd have to find an illustration of it. We'd have to find an example of it. But Nagarjuna gave us great advice. He said that all things are dependently established. Nothing is inherent or independently established. Dependent and independent are a dichotomy, aren't they? They're explicitly mutually exclusive. So therefore, if things are dependently established, there's no way they can be independent or inherent. So Aryadeva answers this group by saying, if something did inherently exist, as you say, it couldn't depend on anything. It couldn't depend on causes and conditions. It couldn't depend on parts. It couldn't depend on being labeled by the mind. And so he says direct perception of the pot that exists by way of its own essence, or inherently, is not possible. Because if it did inherently exist, we should perceive all of its parts simultaneously. But when our visual consciousness perceives the pot's form, pot, this is a pot. This is an Indian pot, or an example of a pot that might be seen in India. If our visual consciousness perceives the pot's form, it does not perceive every single part of the pot. And that's true, isn't it? The pot depends on its parts, such as the front and the back and the sides, the handle, the spout, and the flat part, the bulbous part, the inside. But what can we see of the pot? It's pretty obvious, isn't it? You can only see the front. I can really only see the back. None of us can see what's inside. So that is the proof that the pot does not inherently exist. So we could take another example, like the person. Okay, so here's Rebecca. I can see the front of Rebecca, but I can't see the back of her. You can probably see the back of her, but you can't see the front of her. None of us can see the inside of Rebecca. So, thank goodness. So that's our proof that just by seeing a person like Rebecca and thinking about the fact that we can't see all of her parts demonstrates that she is dependent. She depends on those parts, or our understanding of her, our perception of her depends on those parts for labeling, for naming. So this is one way that we can use this verse in our daily activities. And the thing that's challenging is to remember to do it during the day, isn't it? So if we tie this to something that we already do during the day, like whenever we eat, when we sit down, we can look at the food and we can examine. Can I see all parts of the food? Or am I just seeing the top part? Or, like that. Or when we look in the mirror, we can only see the front part of our face. We can't see the back of the head unless you have another mirror or you somehow turn around. Or when we pull out our cell phones. We don't have cell phones, but probably a lot of people watching this will have a cell phone. If you pull out your cell phone, you can only see the front of the cell phone. Or if you turn it around, then you can see the back, but then you can't see the front. You can't see the insides. So again, these are little examples that we can try to be aware of throughout the day to remind ourselves, to place those little tiny imprints on our mind that things lack inherent existence. And I like this example of the snow. The little tiny snowflakes, they build up over time, and pretty soon there's a big accumulation of snow. And in the same way, we can have a big accumulation, or over time, we can accumulate at least a little more awareness, a little more knowledge of the lack of inherent existence. There's another example that follows along these verses, and the assertion says, the eye, sense faculty, and so forth are inherently existent because one experiences consciousness, their effect. Okay, so it's not really a correct reason, but the eye, sense faculty, and so forth, like our eyes, the subtle part of our eyes, ears, nose, tongue, are inherently existent because we experience consciousness, their effect. So they're really holding to that assertion that if things inherently exist, or if they exist, they must inherently exist. But we know from a little bit of our studies that every new moment of consciousness depends on different things coming together, different causes. So it depends on an object, a focal object. It depends on a sense consciousness, a sense faculty. It depends on a previous moment of mind. When those things come together with contact, then we have a new moment of consciousness arising. So again, this is something that we can be aware of throughout the day. When we're aware that we're seeing something, like the beautiful blue sky today, the fact that we can see that is because of these three conditions coming together that allows us to see the beautiful sky, or to see the snow, or to see the different people around us. So we just have to be creative in finding ways to call this to mind so that we familiarize our mind more and more with recognizing that everything that we see, everything that we hear, everything that we taste and touch and smell, all these things lack inherent existence. Otherwise, we couldn't know them, could we? So by taking, for example, these teachings that Geshe Tabke walked us through, then, and also by doing little exercises like this, then we can really avoid that possibility of becoming hardened to the Dharma or callous to teachings on emptiness. They're challenging, aren't they? They're out of our ordinary. So It takes a little more effort to really think about them and reflect on them, bring them into our daily experiences. I hope that's helpful. If something were inherently existent, then it couldn't depend on anything. So it couldn't depend on the front side and the back side and the parts. It couldn't depend on the parts for being labeled that thing. Oh, because the labeled object and its parts would have to be inherently one. They'd have to be identical. That's how I understand it. You'd have to see everything about that pot or that object. This is all predicated on the understanding that because things appear in a certain way and then we grasp them to exist that way, and then that's what leads into all the exaggerations of attachment and aversion for things. And then actions follow from that, and that's what propels us in cyclic existence. The reason I did the BBC was hopefully so it would become more common in our knowledge, in our thinking.
It just reminds me of when Geshe Tabke was here some years back. One example he gave was how if Joshua stuck his head through the door, just seeing the head, we would label Joshua on that head. At least that example got me thinking about how I am designating things, often based on one small part. So like I'll hear something or you hear someone's voice and already all kinds of associations come with that. Hearing a few sentences sit in a particular way. So I don't know, that helped me. Or at least I'm seeing the designation process for a start. Before I can even recognize, to see like, how am I creating this picture of a person? It's really dependent on these little pieces and things that my mind's putting together. So they cannot exist the way I imagine them to. Yeah. That example was a starting point for me to start seeing that. Then I can't believe my enemy images that I make of people. At least it helps me work with my anger.
Yeah, I just wanted to concur because we react in certain ways to what we experience because we attribute to it a way of being that is incorrect. So by realizing that things don't exist the way they appear, that give us a moment to pause and allows us to react to it or engage with it in a different way.